Jean Piaget, a name you might recognize from one of my earlier videos on the psychology of learning. But who was he? Well, Jean Piaget was a Swiss psychologist and that's a fancy word for someone who studies knowledge. Born in 1896 and died in 1980. He is most famous for his constructivist theory of cognitive development, which basically changed the way we understand how children learn and think. So let's take a look at his ideas. First up, Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Piaget proposed that all children go through 4 stages of cognitive growth, and these stages are universal, meaning they happen to all children regardless of their culture or environment. The first stage is called the sensorimotor stage. This is from birth to about 2 years of age. During this stage, infants learn about the world through their senses and motor actions. For example, they might look at a toy, listen to a sound, or reach out and grasp an object. It's all about exploring and experiencing. One of the major accomplishments during this stage is developing object permanence. You know how sometimes when you're playing peekaboo with a baby, they get really excited when you pop out from behind your hands. They learn that even when they can't see an object, it still exists. And that's a pretty big realization. The next stage is the preoperational stage, lasting from around 2 years old to 7 years old. In this stage, children start using symbols to represent objects and ideas. Think of things like language, pretend play, and also symbolic drawing. Like they might draw a person as a stick figure with a circle for a head, but there's a catch. Children at this stage tend to think egocentrically. That means they struggle to see things from other people's perspectives. Remember that classic experiment where researchers asked kids how someone else might view a scene that they were looking at from an unusual angle? Kids at this stage often struggle with that. They can't imagine how someone else might see things differently, because they haven't mastered that yet. Another thing they struggle with is conservation. This is the idea that certain properties of objects stay the same even if you change the way they look. For instance, if you have 2 identical containers filled with the same amount of liquid, and then you pour it into a differently shaped container, like a taller, thinner glass, they'll often say there is more liquid in the new container even though there's the same amount. It's all about perspective. These kids haven't quite grasped that perspective yet. Then comes a concrete operational stage from around 7 years old to 11 years old. This is when logical thinking starts to develop, but it's still very concrete and tied to physical objects. Children become much better at tasks involving conservation, classification, and reversibility. For example, they understand that if you have 2 groups of objects and an equal number of items in each group, the number stays the same if you move some objects to another group. They also get better at understanding the relationships between objects and their attributes. Finally, the formal operational stage starting from around 12 years old and beyond. This is when abstract and hypothetical reasoning develops. At this stage, individuals can think about complex abstract and theoretical concepts. They can solve algebraic equations, engage in debates about ethics, or imagine and plan for the future. They can consider multiple perspectives and develop solutions to problems that have no clear solution. Okay, so those are the stages. But let's talk about some of Piaget's key concepts. Think of schemas as mental frameworks that we use to organize and make sense of information. Let's say you see a dog for the first time and you might have a schema for dog. Based on that first dog you saw, any new dogs you encounter will fit into that schema. You might call any 4-legged animal with floppy ears and a tail a dog. As you continue to learn about dogs, your schema expands and becomes more detailed. You might learn that not all dogs have floppy ears or maybe a short tail, so your schema changes to accommodate that new information. Then there's assimilation and accommodation. We already talked about schemas, but to recap, assimilation is when we take in new information and fit it into an existing schema. Accommodation is when new information doesn't fit into a schema, so we have to change or adjust the schema to make it work. So let's use an example. Let's say you have a schema for birds. Based on seeing robins, blue jays, and sparrows, you believe that all birds can fly. Then you see a penguin. Penguins don't seem to fit your schema of what a bird is because they can't fly. So you have 2 options. You could assimilate penguins into your existing schema and say, well, penguins are just really bad at flying. Or you could accommodate and change your schema to say that not all birds can fly. Then there's equilibration, which is a fancy way of saying that we try to keep our mental models, our schemas, in balance. So when we assimilate or accommodate, we're moving towards equilibrium. Piaget's ideas had a huge impact on how we understand child development. His ideas influenced modern education by shifting the focus to a more child-centered approach, emphasizing active learning and discovery. His work showed that children aren't just little adults, but rather active explorers who construct their own knowledge of the world. Now, no one's perfect, and Piaget had his share of criticisms. Some argue that he underestimated what infants can do. Research in areas like language development suggests that infants are more competent than Piaget gave them credit for, and others argue that Piaget didn't give enough attention to the role of culture in cognitive development. Different cultures may provide different opportunities for learning, and that can influence how and when children acquire certain skills. Despite the criticisms, Piaget's work was groundbreaking and laid the foundation for a lot of important ideas in developmental psychology. His emphasis on how children actively construct their own knowledge is still a big deal. So thanks, Piaget. If you enjoyed this video and want to keep learning about psychology, subscribe for more content. And if you're interested in taking a deeper dive into the fascinating world of psychology, you can learn more about topics we cover in these videos, explore new ones. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.